Welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we are talking about our top 10 favorite podcast episodes for surviving law school. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're doing a recap of our top 10 law school survival episodes. Not necessarily the most popular ones on these topics, but the ones we think are the most useful. And if you ever want a full list, you can go to lawschooltoolbox.com/podcast, and you'll find a link to 2 different types of archives, by topic or by date. So let's get started. First up, I think one of the keys to law school survival is really time and life management. What do you think, Lee?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this a lot because it's such a big issue.
We do.
It's one of the questions I think that students really bring up to us when they send us their questions. Is about how to find a balance and get everything done and kind of stay sane while you're balancing these new school responsibilities.
Yeah, I think that's right. So in one of our early episodes, which is episode 7, we talk about time and life management basics. So these are really, how to kind of think about managing your life and managing your time. And we cover a lot of topics, actually, in this episode. So, if you're kind of just looking for an intro, I think this is probably a good place to start.
Yeah, because we talk generally about the legal profession as a whole and kind of this idea of work-life balance. But then we also kind of grapple with the issues of, is technology making things better? How can you focus and get work done? And some of the pitfalls of multitasking, which many of us claim we're really good at, but most of us are not.
No one's good at it.
No one's good at it.
Yeah, literally last night I was at the movies with a friend of mine who was on a conference call and trying to buy tickets, and then literally almost walked into a glass wall because she thought it was going to open.
Oh my goodness.
And I was just looking at this, I'm like, what are you doing? The entry door is over there. And it's like, that's an example of what happens. Like, you're listening to a conference call and walking and not paying attention, and you walk into a glass door.
Yeah, you don't want to do that. That's not good. We also discuss things like using a calendar to manage your time. I mean, these things sound simple, but there are some hacks to make it easier to manage your time in your life with just a little thoughtful planning. And we also...
Well, it is also astonishing how many people that we talk to have literally no idea how to calendar their life.
It's true. Yeah. Or where their time goes. I think that's part of it too.
Where their time goes, or people who make, put the appointment on the calendar, but then don't ever follow through. Most of us are not amazing at managing our time, but then a lot of people, particularly a lot of law students, are pretty awful at it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And it's something you don't want to, you want to try and implement early in your law school career, because developing these good habits of time management will serve you through law school and when you enter practice. So you really want to figure out how you need to balance getting stuff done, but also taking care of your life.
Right. In this episode, we dive into a lot of details about what you should be spending your time on. When do you want to start outlining? How much time should you be reading cases? That kind of thing. So if you're wondering, am I taking too long to do this, or am I waiting too long to start, X, this would probably be a good episode for you to listen in on.
And then we have another episode, which I have to be honest is kind of one of my favorites. Episode 134, Strategies for Maximum Personal Productivity, because you and I are kind of nerds where it comes to this. We get really excited about different ways to manage people and tasks and be productive. And so we did a whole episode on how excited we are about our favorite or productivity management tool, which is Trello. We talk about why we're so obsessed and even give you some recommendations on how you can use it to manage your life. there's no one in my life who hasn't heard about Trello, and I was just at a dinner.
Oh,
with
everybody,
a friend.
I know. Yeah,
and I was just at a dinner with a friend who was telling me how she has welded Trello into her life and how it's been ever changed, and I was just so proud.
Yeah, I have a friend I introduced it to, and now she comes back and gives me high-level tips. And I'm like, oh, you are such an acolyte. I love it.
I
know. So this episode 134 is much later in time after we've gotten better at managing our own personal productivity. Right. This is kind of a next-level episode. So I probably wouldn't start with this one if you're like, yeah, I kind of feel like I should have a calendar, right. But I don't.
A to-do list.
So what? How do I check stuff off? This is when you're like, okay, I'm pretty well set, but now I want to next level it. I think actually I just read a book about this, about what we can learn about productivity, believe it or not, from professional chefs, which for me has actually been life-changing. And a lot of this is really about how to create and commit to processes for dealing with your life instead of just kind of winging it as things come up. So, part of what we've learned is everybody has limited willpower. So if you're expecting your willpower just, I'm just going to focus and get things done to get you through law school, it's probably not really going to work or not work as effectively as it could. So the good news is there are tons and tons and tons of tools and apps and strategies and things like that you can employ to make it actually easier to get things done. I think one of my favorite parts about this episode was when our editor, who was listening to our podcast, actually emailed us to ask a question about how he could access some of the tools in this episode because he thought they sounded amazing. So we're like, here you go. Here's the link, dude. You got to, we'll put it out in the show notes. Like, definitely. So if you're looking to, sort of level up your productivity, I think episode 134 is a great place to start.
Yep. We also have another early episode that I think is very important, which is podcast episode number 14, Avoiding Disasters in Law School. I believe that we recorded this after you and I were in a car accident, actually, together.
I think that might well have been.
We were fine. The car wasn't fine. We were sitting. Fine. It wasn't our fault. We were just like sitting in my car and somebody spun into us. So we weren't even doing anything wrong. No texting and driving or anything like that.
We were literally stopped.
But it was interesting, like after that happened, to kind of highlight what, all these things that can happen in law school and in life, and how you can, with a little preparation, make sure that they don't completely derail you.
Right. I think the point of this episode largely is things are going to happen.
Yeah.
And so if you can build your capacity and plan in advance for things that might happen, for example, you had car insurance. Right. So that made it less of a pain in the ass.
Yep. It was still a pain in the ass, but less of a pain in the ass.
Right. Like, it would have been more of a financial hit had you not paid for car insurance. Right. So things like that, things are going to happen. This is why we have insurance. This is why we back up our computers. Everyone is backing up their computer, right? Because I know you're not. Not all of you listening.
Yep.
We heard stories.
Yep.
We know people who, for example, were not able to apply to law review, who would have had a very good shot at being on the law review because they did not back up their submission and their computer crashed an hour before it was due.
Yep.
That is not a good idea.
Yeah.
So the point of this one really is to help you think through what you can do in advance to prevent the things that probably will inevitably happen at some point from being an absolute, complete meltdown.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really, sometimes that's all you can ask for is just managing a disaster enough so there's no meltdown.
Right. I mean, I'm just thinking in like the last year, like I've been through a major earthquake and, I was happy that I had my solar charger that people made fun of me for buying because I'm like, look, I can charge my cell phone and you can't. So, I was happy I had a backup supply of water that people made fun of me for having. But you've got to think about it. If you're going to school in a place where you might have tornadoes or earthquakes or major storms, blizzards, you might be without power. It's amazing the things that don't work if you don't have power.
True.
Like I didn't really think about my water wouldn't work if you don't have power because they're pumping it.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah, that's really inconvenient. All right. So, you've got to think about ways to to get around these things. And And a lot of, I mean, let's face it, a lot of what we kind of term disasters are not that unpredictable.
Right. I mean, sometimes it can be, things that are going to come up in law school that are not that unlikely, like having computer problems at some point. Right. Even during exams, I think a good chunk of people have had that experience at some point.
I mean, who has gotten through law school without having an exam self-meltdown?
Right,
It just is something that's going to happen.
Yeah.
You don't know when, you don't know how bad it's going to be, but I almost guarantee you something will happen.
Something will happen. We talk about testing anxiety and how that can really become a disaster in law school if you don't have a plan to handle it. And then we just talk about rebounding from a difficult time and refocusing and the importance of your community to help you through it, because life doesn't stop for the bar exam. Or not for the bar exam. I was just having that conversation with somebody else. Life does not stop for law school, but what you do have control over is what you do with recovering and asking for help and moving forward. That you do have control over.
Right. And sometimes, those things that go wrong can really be those things that do build your community. I remember when I was starting law school, the power went out in New York City for something like 3 days, which you can imagine was crazy.
Blackout. Yeah.
Yeah, a huge blackout. And I had just met my roommates, one of them, I think, a few days before, but it really was this bonding experience where we're like, okay, so we're now in this unexpected situation. We barely know each other. We don't really have a lot of resources because we've just moved in. Mm-hmm. Like, how are we going to eat? Does anyone have a candle?
Yeah.
Does anyone have a flashlight? Like, it's 100 degrees outside. Does anyone have a fan?
Yeah.
But we made it through, and it became this kind of fun experience. And that's just, gotta look on the bright side sometimes.
Yeah. So asking for help is very important, and we give you kind of some tips to do that. If you need help from your community, you want to make sure that you do, because suffering in silence is not a good idea. And I think, we've been I think in the greater scope of the universe has been talking about this a lot, especially with celebrity suicides that have happened, which are super tragic right now. But this idea of like, when do you ask for help? How do you know if somebody needs help? But I think it's a great rule of thumb to get comfortable with the idea that you're going to need to ask for help at some point, and to have the trusted people you can rely on to reach out to, who will be there for you when you need them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great segue into our next set of recommended episodes, which, going way back.
Way back.
Way back to actually podcast episode numero uno, our very first podcast, which was about mindset. And then we actually did a revisiting mindset follow-up on episode 110. So you can kind of pair these. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I guess, when we started the podcast, we were kind of obsessed with this book, Mindset, by Carol Dweck, who's a Stanford professor, because we realized really a lot of the stuff about surviving and thriving in law school is really about having the right mindset, right?
Yeah, I mean, everybody's going to encounter challenges in law school and in life. It is all about how you react to those bumps in the road. And she talks about the difference between having a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. So a fixed mindset is someone who will say, I'm too stupid to be in law school because this result happened. Whereas someone with a growth mindset would see a challenge and an opportunity to learn and grow. So it's a fascinating book. If you've never read it, if you're on like your summer break or something like that and you have time to read it, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. I think it's a very powerful tool to realize that you have some control over how you create the narrative about challenges, and that can really change the outcomes. So in this episode, we talk about our own stories of overcoming challenges in law school and otherwise. And we also offer some tips for shifting your own mindset to a more growth-oriented way of thinking. Because, I mean, for many of us, that's not the first impulse of how we react to negative situations.
Right, of course. I mean, when you get that first set of grades and suddenly you're not the top of your class and you're not like, oh, I'm so great at school, I'm so smart. If you think, oh, I'm an idiot, like, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. I got a B-, like, I should quit. Like, I'll be a failure forever. My parents are never going to love me. I've always been a failure, whatever internal monologue you have around these things. I think there are things that you can do to consciously shift that dialogue into, more of okay, this is a new experience. Like, I tried my best, but maybe my best wasn't, quite as strong as I would like it to be.
Right.
Where can I go for help? Who can I talk to? Where can I get feedback? How can I break down what happened? Who might be able to look at my exams and help me understand what I need to do differently so that you can set yourself up to do better, because all of this is a learning process.
Yeah.
So no one is born knowing how to write a law school exam. It's just not, unfortunately, the way it works.
Right.
Although some of your professors might claim they're lying. They had to learn too. So, I think this basic concept can be a really useful one. That being said, I'm not sure it's the answer to all of your problems all of the time, which is really about what this podcast 110, Revisiting Mindset, is about. So, the more you read about this, people start to say, well, maybe like over focusing on this and this concept of grit, which we also have a podcast about, maybe this is actually harmful and maybe there's other stuff going on here. And maybe we need to think about that.
Yeah.
So, if you're interested in this concept or this idea, I think both of these combined can be an interesting combo.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we talk about in the Revisiting Mindset episode is the many facets of embracing failure, which I think a lot of this is about embracing and accepting failure and how you handle that and the little failures that are going to come through law school, the law school experience and the life experience. We all stumble and screw things up. That's just how life works. But it's kind of the different strategies. And I think mindset is one of them, but you have to have a bit more of a complete picture for being able to walk forward from disappointments and failures.
Right. And sometimes recognizing that, hey, you know what, if I'm doing really poorly across the board in law school and I don't even enjoy this, maybe it's not just a question of reframing your mindset. Maybe you should just drop out and do something else, and that's fine.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. I mean, there can be situations where this isn't the path that you decide you want to be on, and that's okay as long as that's decisions made in a thoughtful way and not just kind of like made out of fear or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think, you've got to kind of figure out what choices make sense for you. And I think it's Seth Godin who talks about the dip. And so in any process or project, there's going to be this point where, the kind of bloom is off of the rose and you're not like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be in law school. It's so great. Like, I'm going to go be on the Supreme Court and it's all amazing. And then you get your first grades and suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, like maybe not. And then the question is, is this a temporary setback that you just need to push through for bigger and better things? Or is this really, a situation where you're like, oh, my eyes are now open and this is not the right path for me. So you can go read The Dip too. Maybe we should do a podcast on that at some point.
Yeah, that's a good one. Stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned. It's a short book, so we can have a reading club. We'll have a book club.
There we go.
But if you Google that, you can find his chart, which is pretty simple to understand.
Yeah.
If you didn't understand it right there, which was probably also pretty simple.
Yeah. All right, so after we move past kind of the episodes in mindset, the other thing that we think is kind of important to think about when you're thinking of surviving law school is how to make difficult decisions. And this is something we talk about in episode 130. So, should you, like you were just mentioning this decision of should you stay in law school, deciding whether or not you should drop out, or if this is not a path that you want to follow, deciding what kind of jobs you want, choosing a clinic or an externship, whether or not to join a journal, how to spend your time. So we really try and go through kind of some of these difficult decisions that you have to make, but also different tools for helping you make these thoughtful decisions.
Right, because I think there's a lot of external pressure typically in law school where, maybe, and we actually did an episode recently just on toxic behavior. It doesn't even have to reach that point, but just, other people trying to influence you to do something. And, I'm sure in many cases they have your best interests in heart, what they view as your best interests, but maybe those are not really what you want. So, a lot of law school is about making these decisions. What kind of clerkship do you want to apply for when your professor is telling you that you should do one thing and you really want to do something else? Or, where should you work? Maybe you have a significant other who's putting pressure on you for that. What type of jobs are you interested in? Do you really want to do public interest work, but you feel like you have to take a big law job to pay back your loans? These are kind of classic law school questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes it can just be convenient, or not convenient. It can just be reassuring, I guess, to know that you're not the first person who struggled with this choice.
Yeah.
And there may not be, obviously there's not a right answer, but you can, kind of learn from people who've taken different paths, and then you can start to trust your own instincts and say, okay, I think this is what I want to do, or I'm going to make this choice to take this big law job now, but here's how I'm going to transition into something else.
Right. I think that's very true. So you're going to have to make big decisions in law school, but we're all grown-ups by the time we get to law school. It's time to start making big life decisions. So practicing making big life decisions is also a good thing, because you get better at it, deciding what's important to you.
Right. I think sometimes people are surprised at how quickly they have to make those decisions.
Fair
you
point.
think, oh, I'll go to law school and then I'll have 3 more years to decide what I do with my life. That's not really the way it works.
No.
By your first year, sometimes your first semester, you're being asked to decide things like, what kind of job do you want? Where do you want to work? And these are kind of big life-altering decisions that if you're not prepared for them, you may be pretty shocked.
Yeah, exactly. Another area that we think is important to think about in the law school experience and surviving it is relationships, which we talk about in podcast episode number 107, How to Build Positive Relationships in Law School. And so we talk about why relationships matter as part of the legal profession. And
they do.
They do, yeah. And kind of how to go about building those relationships, getting to know your professors in and out of the classroom, developing relationships with your classmates, balancing school activities and social outlets at school to foster interaction with your classmates. What other things did we talk about with relationships in law school?
Well, this one, I think we also talk about mentors and sponsors, which are, really probably work related. Those are the people who are going to help you figure out what you want in your career, get the skills you need, and then hopefully get to that point. Also, how to meet lawyers and non-lawyers in your community through different things like bar association events, pro bono work, charity fundraisers. I know you were on the board of a charity and you met lots of people. So these kind of slightly out of the box ways that you might get involved in your community, which is probably going to make you a happier person, their studies, and also probably going to improve your career prospects because, being a lawyer, a lot of it really is about relationships. And, you don't want to burn a lot of bridges in law school, but you also don't, you don't want to be that person who sits in the back of the room that nobody remembers their name.
Right.
Because that's not going to help you later on. Usually people are asking, oh, I need a referral to this type of lawyer in this area. And, oftentimes people want to refer to their classmates. So if they don't even know who you are, it's probably not going to be so successful.
Yeah, exactly. So relationships are important and you want to be thoughtful because I think a lot of times people do forget that your legal career kind of starts at the beginning of law school in a way.
Right. For sure.
It's not to put a lot of pressure on you that you have to be perfect, but it does help to think of it that way because you can say, okay, well, these are the people that I'm going to be in this profession with. This is the persona that I want to have, in my profession. And, not to be non-authentic, but it does allow you to realize that that's where those relationships are starting and they might, continue for a very, very long time.
Oh, for sure. I interviewed with a judge who had pictures of her 1L study group up on the wall and she was quite old, so you never know these relationships. And I think half of them in the study group had become federal judges, but that's
so
a different story.
Underachieving study group.
Yeah, well, I think she went to Yale or something. But these are the people who are going to be your formational network. Obviously you're going to meet people in your jobs and that kind of thing. But I'm always surprised even how many people still pop up from law school, in my social media feeds and things like that. And I was always like, oh, that guy was great. What's he up to these days?
Yeah.
That's the kind of reaction hopefully you want to foster, not oh my God, do you remember that time that this person did this terrible thing? Which also sometimes I remember.
Yep.
And it's been a while, so people will remember. But episode 107 is really about how to build positive relationships
Right.
in law school so that you will be that person that people think of when they want to refer someone, or they have a question, or they're just kind of curious about what you're up to and they think of you fondly.
Yep. And then kind of in contrast to that, we discussed something also important in episode 59, which is conquering loneliness in law school, which I think is something that often people can be surprised about. So we talk about our own experiences with loneliness in law school, which can come from a lot of different, places, but oftentimes moving to a new city, being around maybe even different types of people, different types of personalities that you have been around before. It can be really hard to meet people if you're an introvert. So you've got to try and find your community, maybe outside the law school, if not inside the law school, so you can take tangible steps to feeling less alone. It's very important.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of studies showing that being alone is, an actual predictor of early death and things like that, or not even being alone, feeling lonely. And so there's actually a distinction between being alone and feeling lonely. Like you can be in the middle of a room, at a networking event or whatever, and you can still feel really lonely because you're like, wow, I don't want to talk to any of these people.
Right.
But, you might be a person who's perfectly comfortable spending several days alone and you're perfectly happy.
Right.
But yeah, I think, this feeling of loneliness is a big part of a lot of people's law school experiences, whether it's moving or trying, feeling like you have to have this persona that's not authentic to you. And then because you're not being authentic, you feel like you can't really connect to other people. So, you're not alone. You're not alone if you feel like this. And there are things that you can do to feel less isolated and to feel less lonely. And I think those things are worth doing because, you're going to have these ups and downs. Like we said earlier, you're going to need a community at some point. So I think, trying to stay connected inside and outside of the law school, staying connected to your non-law school people can be challenging, but I think is really important. So if you're feeling a little down, or that maybe, you don't have as many friends as you had in college and law school, this is a great episode to listen to for some practical ideas on feeling more connected to a community.
Yeah, I really like this episode.
Yeah.
And then on the theme of other challenges, it seems like there are a lot of challenges that come up in law school. But we have a great episode that I think is worthwhile to listen to for most students, which is podcast episode number 72, which is Seeking Accommodations in Law School and the Bar Exam, with a guest, Dr. Jared Meloff, who is out of Beverly Hills. And I think it's important for everyone to just be aware of all of the scope of things that can play into possibly getting accommodations in law school. I think that oftentimes it is an underutilized, I wouldn't say resource, but I guess it is a resource. Would you consider it a resource? I guess accommodations are a resource, but it is underutilized. Yeah, because a lot of law students either think there's a stigma attached to it, or they're not even sure that one of the things that they have struggled with is going to give them accommodations. And so it's something that you do really want to explore in your law school, because if you need accommodations to level the playing field, that doesn't mean that you're going to be a less successful lawyer. That just means that you're going to be able to compete on a level playing field with other law students. And that is important, especially in a world with a curve. So,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And your school will have resources. You just need to kind of be aware of them, and also be in a headspace where you can reach out for that help and get the testing that you need. We touch also on getting accommodations for the bar exam, which is its own beast because it can be a little more difficult to do that. But again, the stakes on the bar exam can feel so high that if you need accommodations, you don't want to wait till the last minute. You want to think about it early and often and make sure you have your ducks in a row so you can get those accommodations for various things. It could be learning disabilities. It could be physical ailments. It could be because if you're recovering from certain types of surgery. It can be health concerns. It can be pregnancy. It can be breastfeeding. It can be so many different things. And I think a lot of people don't really think that they can get accommodations for such a variety of situations.
Right. And my understanding, too, is if you think you're going to be seeking accommodations for the bar exam, it makes it a lot easier if you've had them in law school. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. It looks better if you have had them in law school, unless it's something like a health related.
Right. Sure. I mean, like if you're pregnant and you're unexpected,
right, if you're
taking the bar.
Or you have, a new health concern that has come up. But especially for things like anxiety, learning disabilities, I think that the bars are a little less likely to bite if you're like, I all of a sudden got diagnosed with ADHD after law school. They're kind of like,
right.
Really?
Yeah, like now I need extra time.
Right.
It's like,
Yeah, or now I have clinical anxiety. Oh, really? But you didn't seek any counseling for that during law school? There can be, so these situations come up and they can be valid, but they're a harder sell than if you have a history of getting accommodations in law school.
Yeah, so I think, anyone and oftentimes we talk to people in these sort of unfortunate situations, particularly after their first year or even their first semester, where I can tell just by talking to them on the phone that they probably have a diagnosed learning disability of some type. And then, you ask them about, in high school and college, I always got accommodations, or I was diagnosed with this in high school. But when I got to law school, I thought I'd be okay. And, just talking to them, you say, look, I can tell that you need to deal with this because it's not fair what you're doing to yourself, basically. You're not setting yourself up to be on that level playing field with someone who doesn't have to deal with this. And sometimes people are reluctant to do that, which is, I totally understand. But any school, I think, is actually required by federal law to have a person who deals with this type of situation. So they're going to have resources that you can go to. And I think Dr. Maloff is a great resource just in terms of how he thinks about it and how he talks about it. So if you do think you're going to be seeking accommodations, or maybe that you should be, I think episode 72 is a really fantastic place to start. And if you're really interested in the bar, I think he just did another one for our bar podcast that's even more specific. So check that out.
Yeah, that episode is fantastic. In fact, we should link to that in the show notes because we get into more of the nitty gritty too about how to apply for bar accommodations and what are the pitfalls, how people make mistakes, and also why people delay and procrastinate, which is never a good thing when it comes to asking for
right. And it's not a good thing in law school either. Like,
no.
You don't want to be a week before your first set of exams and not know what the conditions you're taking the test are. Like, you want to start early on this.
And I really have to reiterate that, if you're worried that it's going to reflect badly on you in some way, that I don't know that anyone who's gotten through the exam gamut and been successful because they got extra time is ever, that's not an acknowledgement that's part of your legal career. It's like,
it also would be illegal for anyone to disclose that.
But it's like, if you got an A, it's because you deserved an A. And if you got that A because you had extended time, that's because that leveled the playing field for you. So you had the opportunity to get that A. It's not like you can't compete or that anyone, that means anything else. So I think there is a lot of being okay with that. And so, if you need to speak to disability services or speak to a therapist or really become okay with asking for these accommodations, it can just really change your whole exam experience. I've seen it be really revolutionary for certain students.
It's also good to keep in mind, like, you're not diagnosing yourself. You can't just walk in and say, oh, I'd like to have time and a half. Like, somebody else who is qualified to say, yeah, like, this is a valid thing and here's why. You have to run that gamut. They're not just going to let you have it because you want it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you might even find that that professors may even raise some of their concerns to you, especially after first year exams. I know there are some professors who, will, gently say, hey, have you ever thought about this based on what your work looks like? And so be receptive to that. They're not trying to give you negative feedback. They are really trying to highlight an area where you could get some assistance and change your law school experience.
Right. I mean, it's just like us talking to people. Sometimes you're like, I have a sense this is a problem. It just is. It is a thing that is. And that's all it is.
Yep, exactly. All right. Well, our last episode on our countdown for today, which is also a a guest episode that is incredibly important is podcast episode number 123, Mental Health in Law School and the Legal Profession, with a special guest, Sarah Weinstein, who is a lawyer turned therapist. And we really felt that it was important to do this episode because of the sobering statistics that continue to come out on depression and substance abuse among law students and lawyers. And we wanted to dive into this idea if there's something inherent to law school and the legal profession that really leads to these mental health concerns. But we really wanted to kind of explore this because it's scary and sad and heartbreaking when you read these stories of lawyers being so low that they take extreme, even law students, not just lawyers, law students, they take extreme actions. In their lives, they are super depressed, they make terrible decisions. And, what we as a community, as a legal community, can do to help pick people up and maybe even change certain natures of the legal profession someday to make it a less dark place for so many people.
Right. And I think the reality is a lot of these issues really come up for a lot of people the first time in law school. There are tons of studies and statistics of people come in being basically, about borderline normal, on about everything you can measure them on. And then within a few months, some huge percentage are clinically depressed and anxious and all of these things. I mean, that happened to me my first semester. I guess after my first semester, my second semester, I was clinically depressed. And thank goodness at some point was like, maybe I should go talk to someone about this. So I went and got a therapist, and she was amazing. But it is something that happens. I remember, my second semester of law school and into the second year, I think most people I knew were struggling with some sort of issues. I mean, if they were men, it was basically like they're drinking too much and fighting and, getting in bar fights and things like that, or street brawls. I mean, this is Columbia. It's like, you're an Ivy League law school, really? Like, this is your third street fight in like a month. Like, something might be going on here. And if it was women, it was like, suddenly they're losing tons of weight, or, they're also drinking too much and they're depressed, or, do all kinds of things. These things come up. So, it is a really unfortunate situation. There are probably lots of things that we as a community could be doing, but I think it's something you definitely want to be very aware of. Signs in yourself, signs in other people, signs in classmates. And, to be fair, I had classmates who did reach out to me and say, look, I'm concerned. Like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And I may or may not have been receptive to that, depending on who they were. But, sometimes it was. And it was like, okay, what can I do to help? So one of my classmates, we went to lunch every Wednesday for an entire semester because he's like, I just want, I want to talk to you once a week and kind of see where you're at.
Yeah.
And that was really helpful. I mean, he's not a therapist, but it was really just like, I'm concerned about you, and I want us to have the standing event where we just get together and like have lunch.
Yeah.
Is that cool? And he's like, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. That's a really good point. So this is not the cheeriest episode of them all, but it is critically important. And the statistics don't continue to get better right now.
Right. They never get better.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the crazy thing.
Yeah. So
it's not good.
So you definitely just want to be aware of this. And I think it's good to both evaluate where you are as an individual, and also to be aware of, what's going on in your law school community, so you can be one of those friends who's reaching out to somebody who may be struggling, if that's an appropriate thing to do because of that relationship. So we talk about even different ways that you can help someone that might need professional help, and what can be done to kind of change this mental health climate. So I think it's a very important episode for everybody to listen to, even if it's not the cheeriest one. But there's cheery moments in it. It's not all doom and gloom. It was an interesting episode to record, and I'm really glad we did it.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, I think that's our list, isn't it?
All right, ending on a down note.
I know. I was like, maybe we should have had like the cheerleading for law school one.
I think we have a great self-care episode that you could go listen to. I don't know the number, but I almost added it. So yeah, go look for self-care if you're feeling a little down at this point.
Yeah, I know. Well, with that, unfortunately, or fortunately, it depends on your mood at the moment, we are out of time. You can also find all of our episodes, including archives by episode number and by topic, at lawschooltoolbox.com/podcast, including plenty on self-care. If you enjoy this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.